Hello there, welcome back to Sevilla Storytime. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at the story of the Black Death in Sevilla, which totally decimated the city in 1649. Let's dig in. So the Black Death of 1649 was the worst outbreak that Europe had ever seen. It completely destroyed many parts of Europe, including Spain. Cadiz, Malaga, and other parts of Andalusia were very badly affected. The worst affected by far was undoubtedly Sevilla. The Black Death hit Sevilla between March and June of 1649, or at least that was when it was at its peak. And it's no exaggeration to say that it's the worst epidemic that Sevilla has ever seen. Although the city had suffered other outbreaks before, this was the one that completely destroyed the population. 50% of Sevilla's population was completely wiped out by this mysterious and terrifying disease. I am not a physician of any sort, but according to what I've read and according to my understanding of what the Bubonic Plague was, it's basically a bacteria that affects your lymph glands, your lymphatic system. So once the bacteria enters into your body very quickly, within a matter of hours, begins to attack your lymph glands, and so that's why you will see the appearance of buboes all over the body of the afflicted person. So you'll see the swelling, particularly around the region of the neck area where the lymph glands are, and also under the armpits and in the groin area. It's an absolutely terrifying disease, particularly for the way in which it just seems to appear out of nowhere. It just swoops in. As one chronicler said, there could be people who were, young, fit and healthy, beautiful women, strong, valiant men, having breakfast perfectly fine, fit as a fiddle, and by the time it was dinner time, they were dead. It was literally that quick. And it was the swiftness of the disease that really terrified people, because people didn't understand science in the same way that we do today. We still have a lot to learn, but they didn't understand, bacteria. They didn't understand how diseases were spread. They didn't have antibiotics or a lot of the knowledge that we thankfully have today. And also they were living in a very religious time. The swiftness of this disease felt to many people like the judgment of God, the wrath of God. I mean, think about it. If you don't have any understanding of biology or of how the human body and contagions work, and you're very, very religious and you believe that your sins are going to be punished, then I can fully understand why somebody would come to that conclusion. Death comes out of nowhere and wipes out everyone around you. If you're lucky, if it doesn't get you. I can't begin to comprehend, thankfully, how terrifying this disease is. I mean, the closest that we've come in modern times would be obviously coronavirus and maybe the Spanish flu, which I do believe was worse than coronavirus. But I'm telling you, coronavirus compared to the Bubonic Plague, honestly, terrifying times. Just to give you a bit of context, at this period of time, the 1640s, Sevilla was literally one of the most powerful cities in the world, and in fact was known as Caput Mundi, the head of the world. I tell people this quite a lot, and I get kind of mixed reactions. Most people haven't got a clue what I'm talking about when I say that Sevilla was literally the most powerful city in the world. Although it has to be said that by the time the 1640s came around, the city was beginning to see a bit of a decline, but it was still considered to be the new Rome, the new Babylon. It was still very much basking in the former glories of the discoveries of the Indies or the Americas and its golden age. But sadly, in just a few short months, all of that would end. Literally half of the population was gone in the blink of an eye, and it's safe to say that the city was totally traumatized and never recovered from this epidemic. So around the time when the Black Death broke out in Sevilla, Sevilla had absolute control of the ports, of the goods that were coming in from the Americas, foreign exports. This rich merchant trade completely influenced how Sevilla operated. So it had some of the most stunning architecture in the world. The economy was booming, and it was one of 3 of the most populated and successful cities in Europe. So a lot of the American trade coming from overseas was still very much controlled by Spanish merchants and sailors, and the port of Sevilla was thriving. Like, it was the most successful and important port city that didn't have the sea connected to it. So if you think about Cadiz, it's a port city, but it's right next to the sea. Sevilla is an inland city, it's not next to the sea, and yet it was highly important for trade. The port of Triana and the nearby Arenal area were booming, full of life. There were markets, there were meat markets, there was all kinds of trade going on. Just a lot of life, a constant flow of people coming in and out of the city, boats coming in. Yeah, just absolutely thriving, I would say. Unfortunately, the bacteria of the Black Death was also thriving. So in 1649, the Black Death arrived to Sevilla. It had already previously hit Cadiz. In fact, people in Cadiz had been quite badly affected by the Black Death, and Sevilla had actually gone into quarantine, but it was impossible to keep up this quarantine because it was such a thriving city. Because of that constant flow of people, this is how the Black Death managed to come into Sevilla. The chronicles say that it was because of gypsy merchants leaving Sevilla and going to Cadiz to go and buy fabrics and clothing. This is not to point the blame at anyone. Who could have known? Apparently these gypsies went to Cadiz and they brought these textiles, they brought these fabrics with them to Sevilla without knowing that the fabrics were actually already infected with the Black Death. According to the chronicles, those gypsies were from Triana. They went out and they came back and they brought the Black Death with them. Unwittingly, of course. You know, it's just life. These things happen. What can you do? So one important thing to note is that at this point in time, in the winter preceding 1649, so the winter of 1648 and going into the spring of 1649, very strangely for Sevilla, because it's usually very clement weather here, it would not stop raining. It was raining constantly, literally downpour after downpour after downpour. I mean, it has to be said, sometimes here in Sevilla in February, it does rain quite a lot. I'm from Manchester. I'm from one of the rainiest cities in the UK. So I was quite appalled when I first arrived here. One of the first things that happened to me was that I got water damage on my mobile phone because it would not stop chucking it down for the first 2 or 3 weeks that I was here. I mean, it was beautifully sunny, and then it would just rain, 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 and then it stopped, and then it was boiling hot for the rest of history. The irony: a girl from the rainiest city in the UK comes to Andalusia and gets water damage on her phone from the rain. You couldn't make this stuff up. Anyway, I digress. In the Semana Santa of 1649, not one of the hermandades went out, and this was before the Black Death hit. And that was because of the intense flooding. I mean, how can you go out in a procession if it's... You'd have to wade through the procession, so it just wasn't going to happen. So basically it was raining a lot in the winter of 1648, and that had an impact on the spread of the Black Death in Sevilla. The river flooded its banks and just continually kept flooding over. Sevilla has had sporadic inundations, floods, you know, that even today you can still see around the city some of the tiles that mark the points to which the river burst its banks and flooded the city, and this was still happening in the 20th century. There are photographs that exist of people like boating around the Alameda. Yeah, so it's not completely out of the ordinary for floods to happen in Sevilla. I think the infrastructure has changed to kind of prevent these sort of things from happening, but floods did happen. So the river just kept on rising. Near the cathedral, there's the Arco of the El Postigo de Aceite, So it's, you know, this archway, and you can see that the pavements are very, very high up. And the reason for that is because Sevilla kept flooding. So now it's a bit of a nuisance for us, as we, you know, it's a bit of a hazard if you ask me. I've nearly fallen off those pavements more times than I've had hot dinners. But they're like that because Sevilla just floods. Well, it used to flood quite frequently. And if you walk through there, you'll see that there's two columns that are kind of integrated into the wall, and they were there to sustain like wooden planks to try and keep the water out of the inside of the city. So remember, Sevilla was also a walled city with various doors or arches, gates, I should say. So they would try their best to keep the water out using these wooden doors. But that just had the effect of kind of almost creating like a swimming pool kind of effect. The water just kept rising and rising and rising and rising. When it finally stopped raining and the waters receded back into the river and everything settled down again, by that point it was already kind of too late for two reasons. One reason was that the flooding of the river and the water coming into the city brought with it all of the kind of the dilge and the mud and the dirt. You know, it happens wherever there's a flood. When the waters recede, the river leaves behind crap, basically, just a ton of crap throughout the streets of the city. Yeah, just everything that the water carried with it was left behind. So that was not a sanitary condition to begin with. And another consequence of the flooding was that people, they couldn't really live near the rivers. So everyone that would normally spend all of their time by the riverside began to seek refuge within the inner walls of the city. And everybody was sort of receding back, everybody packing into the city together, everybody living in close conditions, in unsanitary, unhygienic conditions. And, you know, you can just imagine that is a breeding ground for bacteria, for all kinds of germs and diseases, apart from the Black Death. But imagine with the Black Death hanging around, it's just not hygienic at all. Those are the first two consequences of the flooding. And a third consequence of the flooding was that people began to actually starve. Now we understand the importance of the immune system. We know that we need to have vitamins and minerals. We need to have a good balanced diet, healthy food, in order to live a healthy life and to combat illnesses and to have all of the antibodies that we need to fight illness. But unfortunately, because of the incessant raining, continuous just rain, the crops flooded. There was nothing to make bread with. One chronicler says that within Sevilla there was not even an ounce of bread and no meat in the meat markets. There were actually stories in the spring of 1649 of people being so famished, so hungry, that they would actually go to the riverside in Triana and start eating dead fish that were left on the side, on the shore. They were already dead. They were probably rotting already. People were desperate. So that's never going to help, is it? If you're malnourished, you won't have a strong immune system. So it's logical that they're the first ones to fall. Logical. So if we add into the pot malnourishment, unsanitary conditions, and people all cramped together, and the Black Death just on the horizon, obviously it's a recipe for disaster. Of course, as ever, it was the poor people who were the first people to be affected by the Black Death. The first cases that we have in Sevilla, well, the first recorded cases were in the area of the Chapina, which is in Triana. It's near, if you're into your Hermandades of Sevilla, you'll know where El Cachorro, La Basilica del Cachorro, that whole area there, all of that region there is where the poor people lived. So they were actually Portuguese slaves and African slaves that lived there, and gypsies as well. They were the first ones to fall. And it's kind of logical as well because they were living in poorer areas, but they were also closer to the river, so there was probably more crap everywhere. There began to be sightings of clerics waiting at the ends of streets to take dead bodies out of houses. This is where the nightmare really begins. From around April 1649, things start to get really out of control. Remember that in those days, people had no means of communication except for speaking to each other, word of mouth. Most people were illiterate at this point as well, so maybe some people could read, but in most cases, people just communicated by talking to each other. So today you might have the World Health Organization sending out information on what to do, how to wash your hands. Why weren't you washing your hands before? Organizations like the World Health Organization now would send out a tweet or a Facebook message or whatever to tell us the best way to cope with a crisis like this. But back then they had no idea. They were just doing whatever they wanted, whatever they thought was right, with no real medical or scientific basis for what they were doing. For many people, it was just business as usual. Obviously, they were aware that something was going down. They were hearing stories, but if it didn't personally affect them, I wasn't there, but I can only assume that most people were just kind of thinking, oh, well, we just have to keep going. Let's pray about it, and that's it. So as the cases start to mount up and things start to get pretty serious, they were already pretty serious. The government, the town hall, the people in charge of the city, realize that they don't actually have an action plan of what to do here. What would you do in a situation like that without any real medical knowledge? Their solution was actually to set up a plague hospital. I think there was more than one plague hospital in the city, but the biggest and the most famous was El Hospital de las Cinco Llagas, the Five Wounds of Christ. That building still exists today. It's actually in front of the Basilica de la Macarena. It's where today the Parlamento de Andalucía, the Andalusian Parliament, has their sessions there. That's their seat. It was made by Catalina de Ribera. She gave it over to the authorities of Sevilla to open it up as a hospital for the victims of the plague. So basically this was for the government of Sevilla at this point. This was plan A, plan B, plan C and plan D. I think plan E was just to pray. I don't think there really was a plan. It was just, let's set up a hospital and see if this thing goes away. So this was where all of the medics and the surgeons, all of the best doctors were. And so if someone had the plague, if someone had the Black Death, they would go to the hospital of Cinco Llagas, the Five Wounds of Christ, and they would be attended. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that the Black Death was extremely contagious and could take effect within the blinking of an eye. So even the people who were appointed as the responsible for the hospital, so there was always one person in charge, like the director of the hospital, it's normal. Every person that was put in charge just dropped like flies. The first person was Antonio de Viana. He died within, I think it was a matter of days. He was replaced by Juan Peculio, who then also died within a matter of days. Can you imagine how terrifying this must have been if you were a patient there and you were even conscious of what was going on, to see that even the people that were supposed to be saving your life, they were also dropping down. It just must have been absolutely petrifying for these people. They appointed a religious friar named Fray Blas de la Milla, who was a member of the Mercedarios, so it's a religious order, which had its seat in what is now El Museo de las Bellas Artes. So if you go to the art gallery of the Museum of Bellas Artes, you'll see within that building that there are different patios, like very grand cloistered areas, and that's because it was actually a convent. It was a religious building. It was where the Mercedarios had their seats. And one of the exhibition salas, one of the exhibition rooms, was actually a chapel. So if you go, I think it's the one where they have the Murillo exhibition, permanent exhibition, that was, you can see it if you go in, you can actually see that it was a chapel. In a similar way, when you go to the Parlamento de Andalucía, where they have their sessions and their political debates, you can see that it was clearly a chapel beforehand, and that was because it was a plague hospital, and that would have been the chapel. Anyway, I digress. That's what they're going to put on my tombstone when I die. They're just going to say, here lies Lisa. She digressed to death. Fray Blas de la Milla didn't drop down like a fly. He successfully managed to take the running of the hospital into his hands, but that doesn't mean by any means that it was an easy task. It was the stuff of nightmares, it was hellish, mainly because nobody really knew what was going on. By the time May comes around, May 1649, even rich people are falling. So, up to now, it's just been mainly people in poor areas, it's been people who are malnourished, people in the rundown areas, but now the rich people are getting sick. And when rich people start getting sick, that's when we start to take it seriously. Because rich people count, So even those with the best food, the best amenities start to fall too. And one chronicler said that now almost all of the city was a hospital. Now, when that person said almost all of the city was a hospital, they didn't mean hospital in the way that we think of a hospital, where people are being tended to and things get sorted out. They were talking about absolutely hellish scenes unfolding all throughout the city. They started to set up what I suppose you could call transport links to go and collect people who were sick, so the dying or the infected, to scoop them up and to take them to the hospital. I guess sort of kind of like ambulances, but not ambulances, because they were basically just carts drawn by oxen. As time went on, they had to increase the size of the carriages because there were just so many people that were sick that there just wasn't enough transport to go around. So these carriages weren't just collecting the sick, they were collecting dead bodies. They were collecting corpses, and there were just so many of them that nobody knew what to do. There's actually descriptions of mind-blowing scenes. If you go to the cathedral today, one of the most touristy places in Sevilla is undoubtedly El Patio de los Naranjos, where you have the Puerta del Perdón. It's a lovely place to take photos. People, sit on the steps and eat their ice cream and chat away and look at their maps to find out where they're going to go next. It's all very like, oh, what an adventure. But if we go back to 1649, on those very steps outside the cathedral, what would you find? Piles and piles and piles of dead bodies. Hundreds. One of the records says that there was something like 300 dead bodies on those steps every day. I mean, it breaks my heart when I think about it, because I love Sevilla, and it was hard enough to see Sevilla during the COVID pandemic. This just doesn't bear thinking about, really. This is very morbid. I'm always talking about dead people. I mean, this is my vocation in life. Want to talk about a dead person? Call me. It wasn't just outside the cathedral, there were also piles and piles of dead bodies outside the Church of El Salvador, which is another very, very touristic site if you go now. Lots of the main centres of Sevilla were just overflowing. What do you do if literally half of the city is dead and people are just dropping like flies around you? What would you... They just started to pile up. Obviously, that also led to an absolutely atrocious smell throughout the city, an unbearable stench. And it got to the point where there were literally no more cemeteries left. There were no more burial spaces. And even if there were sufficient spaces, there was just no way that there was time to bury all of these people. So it got so bad that some of the churches started taking the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, they started taking it out of the church and just running away. Just desolate times.